The frost was on the wrong side of the glass. It faced inward, and it hadn't been there when he went to sleep. Elias Mott noticed it on the morning of January 14th, 1892, when he got up to build the fire back and crossed the room to look out the east window. He had looked out that window on winter mornings for 8 years. He knew what it looked like. Frost on the outside of the glass, the inside clear and slightly warm from the cabin's retained heat. He knew this so well he had stopped consciously seeing it. This morning the frost was on the inside. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, quiet places, and things that don't quite leave, consider subscribing. There are more waiting. He stood in front of the window and looked at it. The pattern was the same as outside frost. The feathered branching of ice crystals on glass, the specific geometry of water vapor depositing as ice on a cold surface. But it was on the inside face of the glass. He put his finger to it and felt the cold of it and the specific roughness of ice crystals, and he looked at his fingertip and saw the small amount of ice that had come off onto it. He looked at the fire. The banked coals were still there, still warm. The cabin at the temperature of a cabin that had been banked overnight and not yet rebuilt. Cold, but not the cold that produced frost on interior glass surfaces. He had woken in colder cabins than this. He had never woken to find frost on the inside of a window. He rebuilt the fire and watched the window. The frost did not melt. He watched it for the first 20 minutes with the expectation that it would. That was the normal sequence, the thing that was supposed to happen. Fire comes up, room warms, frost melts. He had watched that sequence hundreds of times, and the expectation was so deep he could almost see the frost thinning before it happened. The frost did not thin. The fire came up to full heat and the cabin warmed. The center of the room warming, the air warming, his own body warming as it always did when he built the morning fire. He watched the east window for 45 minutes. The frost on the inside of the glass did not melt. He put his hand close to the glass without touching it. Cold air was coming off the glass, not the mild coolness of a well-glazed window in winter, but the specific cold of a surface significantly below the temperature of the room. The glass was as cold as the outside air. The glass was behaving as though the room on its inside did not exist. He said nothing to anyone for 2 days. He was the kind of man who processed what he saw before he reported it, and what he was seeing required processing. On the second day, something else happened. He kept a tin cup of water on the shelf beside the east window. A habit of years, water within reach when he woke. That morning, the water in the cup was frozen solid. The cup was 6 inches from the window. The cabin was at 51 degrees. The kettle on the stove was hot. He stood in the cabin with a frozen cup in one hand and a hot kettle on the stove behind him, and looked at the east window. 6 inches from the glass, the water had frozen. 6 feet from the glass, the kettle was boiling. He moved the cup to the south shelf that same morning. He did not move it back. Over the following days, he found himself making other small adjustments without consciously deciding to. He stopped resting his arm on the east windowsill when he looked out, had done this habitually for 8 years, leaning against the frame while he checked the morning sky. He stopped. He began sitting with his back to the south wall rather than the east wall at the table. He noticed, one evening, that he had pulled his sleeping platform 6 inches west of where it had been for years. He had not noticed himself doing it. He did not touch the glass after the first week. Not because he had decided not to, because every time his hand moved toward it, something in him redirected it. He was aware of this, and he was honest enough to note it in his journal. I no longer touch the east glass. I do not have a reason I can state. I have a reason I can feel. Elias Mott had been in the Ozark Ridge country since 1882, 10 years before that January, and had been in this particular cabin for 8 of those years. He had built it himself on the south-facing slope of the East Ridge, above the Black Hollow, positioned to catch the winter sun and sheltered from the north wind by the ridge's bulk. The specific orientation of a man who knew cold weather and who had thought carefully about where to put a structure he intended to spend many winters in. The cabin was sound. He had built it well, and he had maintained it well across 8 winters, replacing the chinking when it cracked, keeping the roof free of heavy snow accumulation, tending the single window's glazing with the attention of a man who knew that a window was the most vulnerable point in a winter cabin. He had reglazed the east window the previous spring when he found a crack he didn't like. The new glazing was intact. He had checked it carefully when the cold came on in November. He knew this cabin. He knew it in the way a man who had spent 8 winters in a single structure knew it. Not just its dimensions and its layout, but its behavior, the specific ways it responded to weather and cold and heat. He knew how long it took to warm from a banked fire on a morning at 0 degrees. He knew how much wood a night fire required to hold a comfortable temperature. He knew the specific drafts that came through the north wall in a hard northeast wind. He knew the cabin's temperature map, which corners ran cold, which wall ran warm, where to put the bed for the most comfortable sleep in January. He knew what frost on the inside of a window meant, and he knew it had not happened before in 8 years. He spent those 2 days paying careful attention to what was happening. He maintained the fire at its normal rate and watched the temperature of the room. The room was warmer than it should have been for frost to form on an interior glass surface, significantly warmer. His breath was not visible when he exhaled, which was what he would expect at cabin temperature with a good fire, but the glass was frosted on the inside. He touched the frost several times on both days, confirming its temperature and its substance. It was real ice. It had the specific sharp cold of ice crystal rather than the smoother cold of cold glass. He scraped a small section of it with his fingernail, and it came away as ice, leaving clear glass behind, and the clear section refrosted within hours. On the second day, he put a thermometer against the inside of the glass. The thermometer read 22 degrees. The room temperature at the same moment, measured by the same thermometer at the center of the room, was 51 degrees. The glass surface was 29 degrees colder than the surrounding air. This was not the behavior of a window in a heated room. This was the behavior of a piece of glass that was exposed to outside air on both sides. He stood with the thermometer for a long time after the reading. He had put thermometers in a great many places over 8 winters. He knew what numbers meant in the context of a heated cabin. 22 degrees at an interior glass surface, while the room ran at 51, was a number that did not belong inside. He wrote both numbers in his trapping journal and sat at the table and looked at them. On the 3rd day, he told Nathan Webb. Nathan Webb had been in the Black Hollow for 14 years and was the person the Hollow went to when it needed something examined carefully. He was 54 years old and had the temperament of a man who had been solving practical problems in difficult terrain for a long time. Patient, precise, not given to conclusions before the evidence supported them. He came to the cabin and he stood in front of the east window and he looked at the frost on the inside of the glass and he put his hand close to the glass and he said, "It's cold," Elias said. 22 degrees at the glass surface this morning. Nathan looked at the fire, which was going strong. 51 in the room. Elias said, 53 when I measured this morning. Nathan said, 31-degree differential at the glass. That's not possible in a heated room. He said it the way he said things he had confirmed were true, even though they were wrong. Flatly, without drama. The statement of a fact that the evidence required him to make regardless of whether it fit his understanding of how things worked. He examined the window carefully. He checked the glazing, the seal around the glass, the fit of the frame in the wall, the condition of the chinking around the frame. He found nothing. The window was, as Elias had reported, sound, intact, no crack, no gap, no path for outside air to reach the interior glass surface. He pressed his hand against the wall beside the window. He said, "The wall is cold." Elias said, "I know." Nathan pressed his hand flat against the wall's interior surface. Not the window, the wall itself, the chinked timber wall, and held it there for 30 seconds. The way you held your hand against something when you were taking a careful reading rather than a passing one. Then he moved his hand to a different point along the east wall, and another, working methodically south along the wall's length. He went to the north wall and did the same. He went to the south wall. He went back to the east wall. He said, "The east wall is colder than the north wall." Elias said, "I noticed that." Nathan said, "The north wall is the exposed side." He said, "In a normal cabin in January, the north wall runs coldest. It faces into the wind, into the sustained cold, into the longest nights." He said, "Your east wall is running colder than your north wall." He said, "Your east wall is colder than your most exposed wall." He stood in the center of the cabin and turned slowly, looking at each wall in sequence. "Your south wall is the warmest, which is what I'd expect." He said, "Your west wall is next. Then, your north wall." He said, "The east wall is the coldest wall in this cabin. The east wall faces the morning sun in this location. On a south-facing slope, the east wall catches the earliest and some of the most direct winter light. Physically, the east wall should be among the warmest. It is the coldest." Nathan stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at the east wall. "I've checked the structure. The structure is sound. The cold on the east side exceeds what the structure should produce. I can't tell you why." He went home and came back the following day with 2 more thermometers. He placed one at the center of the room, one against the east wall's interior surface, and one against the north wall's interior surface. He took readings every 2 hours for a full day. The east wall read 10 to 15 degrees colder than the north wall throughout the day. This cabin is coldest on the side that faces the morning sun. In the natural world, that is the warm side. In this cabin, it is the cold side. I don't have an explanation for that. Elias had been sleeping in the cabin through all of this, because it was his cabin, and he had nowhere else to sleep, and because the anomaly had not made the cabin uninhabitable, only strange. He kept the fire going at its maximum, burning more wood than he normally burned, and the cabin stayed warm enough to sleep in and warm enough to work in. But the east wall stayed cold, and the east window stayed frosted on the inside, and the room had the specific quality of a room that was working harder than it should have to be warm. Elias kept a record. He had kept a trapping journal for 8 years, and the January entries that year were different from any previous January, alongside the trap counts and the weather notes and the travel distances. A growing column of temperature readings from different points in the cabin, taken at consistent times each morning. January 15th, glass surface 22, room center 51, differential 29 degrees. January 16th, glass surface 19, room center 53, differential 34 degrees. January 19th. Glass surface 17. Room center 55. Differential 38 degrees. The differential was growing. The room, with the fire maintained at full burn, was getting warmer. His efforts to heat the space were succeeding at the center of the room. But the east glass was getting colder, as though the warmth at the center was drawing the cold at the wall into a sharper opposition. He wrote this observation in the journal and found it alarming. The more he heated, the colder the wall ran. He was making the problem worse. He tried reducing the fire. On January 17th, he maintained the fire at a lower level, keeping the room temperature at 43 degrees, cold but livable in his winter gear. He measured the glass surface, 20 degrees. The differential was 23 degrees, less than it had been at the higher room temperature. He noted this: lower room temperature produces smaller differential. He thought, the cold at the wall is relative to the warmth in the room. As the room grows warmer, the wall grows colder to match. He did not know what to do with this. On January 22nd, he left the cabin for 3 days to check his trap lines on the north drainage. He was gone from the 22nd to the 24th. When he returned on the morning of the 25th, he rebuilt the fire and noticed almost immediately that the east window's interior frost was thinner than he had left it. Not gone, still present, still cold to the touch, but thinner, the crystal patterns less dense, the glass underneath more visible than it had been. He noted this in his journal. He also noted that the east wall, when he pressed his hand against it, was cold, but not as cold as the readings from the week before. He estimated the differential between wall and room temperature was smaller, 10 degrees perhaps, rather than the 30+ he had been measuring. He sat in his chair and thought about what it meant that the anomaly was less severe when he was absent. He went to Nathan Webb and told him. Nathan said, "You're certain it was less?" Elias said, "I can't give you numbers because I wasn't here to measure." He said, "I can tell you what I observed when I came back and what it looked like compared to what I'd been observing for the previous week." Nathan said, "And it was less." Elias said, "Yes." Nathan sat with this for a moment. He said, "The cold responds to your presence." He said it carefully. The way he said things he was not fully comfortable saying, not as a theory, not as a conclusion, but as a description of the pattern that the evidence produced. When you're in the cabin, the cold is stronger. When you're absent, it diminishes. That's what the evidence says. I want to be careful about what I mean by responds. I'm not saying it knows you're there. I'm saying there's a correlation between your presence and the severity of the cold. There could be a physical explanation. A person produces body heat. A cabin with a person in it is warmer than a cabin without one. A warmer interior may create a greater differential with whatever is on the cold side of the east wall, and a greater differential may drive the cold more strongly inward. That's a possible account. Elias said, "It's a possible account." Nathan said, "I don't fully believe it." He said it honestly. In the way he said things he was being precise about. The account would explain why the cold was less when you were absent. It doesn't explain why the east wall is colder than the north wall, or why the glass is frosted on the inside, or why the differential at the glass surface is 30 degrees when the room is at 50. The account explains one thing and leaves the other things unexplained. I have a better account. I don't like it as much. Elias said, "Tell me." Nathan said, "The cabin is losing its interior." He said, "Not structurally. The walls are there, the roof is there, the window is there. The quality of the interior. A cabin is defined by the difference between the inside and the outside. The wall as a membrane, that maintains a distinction. The east wall of your cabin is not maintaining that distinction. The inside of the east wall is behaving as though it is outside. The cold is not coming in through the wall. The inside of the wall has become cold in the same way the outside is cold, without the cold passing through. He paused. I don't know what that means, physically. I know it's what the measurements show. The Hollow heard about the cabin over the following weeks, because word moved in the Hollow, the way it always moved, and because some of the Hollow's people had occasion to be at the Mott cabin and had experienced what they experienced when they were there. Margaret Cord came to bring Elias some meal in the second week of February and stood in the cabin for 20 minutes and said, when she left, I didn't want to stay. She said it to her husband, Thomas, without elaboration, and Thomas told Nathan, and Nathan added it to his account of the cabin. She said, it wasn't cold enough to be a problem. The fire was going, and it was warm enough. I just didn't want to stay. Thomas said, why? She said, I don't know. It felt like being outside. I know I was inside. It felt like being outside in a way I couldn't point to, and I didn't want to stay. Thomas Webb, Nathan's son, 22 years old, who had grown up in the Hollow and who was not a person given to the kind of sensitivity that Margaret was describing, came to help Elias with a repair on the north wall in the third week of February and worked inside the cabin for 2 hours. When they were done, he stepped outside and said, that's better. Nathan asked him about it afterward. Thomas said, I kept wanting to check if the door was open. The whole time I was in there, I had the feeling the door was open, or a window was broken. Something was coming in. I checked the door twice and the window, and everything was closed. The air felt wrong, not cold enough to be wrong. It just felt like it wasn't. Contained. Like the cabin wasn't holding the air the way a cabin held the air. Nathan added this to his record and considered it carefully. He said, you are describing a phenomenological quality, not a measurement, not a number, a quality of the space. A cabin has an inside quality, the quality of being indoors, the specific warmth and enclosure that a closed, heated structure provides. You're saying this cabin has lost that quality. Thomas said, I'm saying it felt like I was outside. Nathan said, yes. He wrote, the interior quality of the cabin is perceptible to visitors, not as a measurable temperature difference, as a quality of the space. The cabin no longer feels like an inside. He sat with this for some time. He was a man who preferred to work with numbers, temperatures, differentials, measurable quantities. The numbers were telling him something was wrong with the east side of the cabin. What Thomas and Margaret were describing was something the numbers could not capture. The cabin had stopped being the kind of space a cabin was supposed to be. Not because the walls had failed, or the roof had leaked, or any structural thing had changed. Because something about the cabin's basic quality, its ability to hold a distinction between inside and outside, had been compromised from within. He wrote, the cold is not a cold that the structure produces. The structure is sound. The cold is a cold that the space itself is producing, drawing from the outside rather than protecting against it. I don't know what that means. I know what it looks like from the inside, and I know what it feels like to anyone who enters. It feels like the cabin has accepted the winter. Elias Mott stayed in his cabin. He stayed because it was his cabin, and because the cold had not made it uninhabitable, and because he was a man who had decided that the cabin was his winter situation, and he was going to manage it. He increased the wood supply. He added a second layer of chinking to the east wall in a week of mild weather in late January. He sealed the east window frame with additional material. None of it made a measurable difference. The east wall continued to run colder than the north wall. The east window continued to frost on the inside. He continued to burn more wood than the cabin should have required. The room continued to warm, but with the quality. He wrote this in his journal, the phrase surprising him as he wrote it, of a room that was being warmed rather than being warm, a room that was receiving heat rather than holding it. He thought about this distinction. A warm room held its heat, the walls and the air and the surfaces all at approximately the same temperature, the system in equilibrium. What he had was different. The fire providing heat, the air in the center of the room accepting the heat, but the east wall and the east window continuously drawing the heat away, refusing equilibrium, maintaining the differential regardless of how much he burned. He wrote, "The east side of the cabin is a heat sink. I can heat this room to 60 degrees, and the east wall will be at 30, and the window glass will be at 20. I can add more wood, but I cannot change the differential. The east wall is not warming. I have chinked and sealed, and I have added material, and I have checked every surface and found no path for outside air." He wrote, "The east wall is cold on the inside, for a reason I cannot find." He stayed through February. In the second week of February, he stood at the east window at dusk and looked at the frost on the inside of the glass, and he stopped. The patterns in the frost, the branching ice crystals that had been forming since January, were not random. They had been random in January, the usual feathered spread of frost on glass. Sometime in the past week they had changed. The crystals had grown into formations that rose from the bottom edge of the glass upward, in shapes that branched and narrowed as they rose, irregular at the base and tapering at the top. He looked at the frost for a long time. He went to the door and opened it, and looked at the east ridge across the hollow. The ridge timber, the bare winter trees, the specific silhouette of the Ozark Ridge forest in February, the trunks at the base, the branches spreading upward, the forms narrowing and branching against the winter sky. He went back inside and looked at the frost on the inside of his east window. It was the ridge. The frost was growing in the shape of the ridge timber. Not precisely, not a perfect copy, but unmistakably the same form. Upward growth, branching, tapering. The shapes you saw when you looked east at the tree line. The window was showing him what was on the other side of it. Not through the glass, in the frost on the glass. He stood there for a long time without moving. In the first week of March, he noticed the frost patterns had changed again. Not grown, changed. The crystal patterns had shifted from the feathered branching of ordinary window frost to something else. A pattern of larger, more deliberate-looking formations. The crystals growing in directions that did not follow the usual geometry of frost on glass. He stood in front of the window in the March morning and looked at the frost and thought about patterns. He knew frost patterns. He had been looking at frost patterns on windows and on ground for 8 years of Ozark winters, and he knew what they looked like. The patterns on his east window this morning looked like something he had not seen on a window before. They looked like the frost he saw on the ground outside the cabin, on the dead grass at the base of the north wall, on the soil near the creek where the cold air pooled at night. Ground frost, the frost of a surface that lay flat and still in cold air at ground level. He had never seen ground frost on a vertical glass surface, but he was looking at it now. He called Nathan. Nathan came and looked at the window and was quiet for a long time. He said, "Those are ground frost patterns." Elias said, "That's what I thought." Nathan said, Frost on glass makes feathered patterns because the cold moves outward from the contact points on the glass surface, in the temperature gradient of a vertical surface. Frost on ground-level surfaces makes different patterns because the cold air is settling, pooling, growing crystals in the horizontal plane. The patterns are different because the conditions that make them are different. These patterns suggest horizontal conditions. Still cold air at ground level. The inside of your window is experiencing ground-level conditions. They stood in front of the east window in the March morning and looked at the frost patterns that should not have been there, and neither of them said what they were thinking, which was that the window's inside face was no longer inside. Nathan said, eventually, "I want to measure the temperature at the base of the east wall, at floor level." They measured it. 24 degrees at floor level against the east wall. The floor temperature at the cabin's center was 48 degrees. 24 degrees at the wall's base was below freezing. The base of the interior east wall was below freezing in a heated cabin. Nathan wrote in his record that evening, "The cold has spread downward from the window." In January, it was concentrated at the glass surface. In early February, it had reached the middle section of the east wall. In March, it has reached the base. The line of cold is moving inward. I have been measuring this for 2 months. The progression is consistent and directional. The cold moves from the east glass surface inward. It moves slowly. The rate of change across a month is significant, but not sudden. But it moves. At the current rate, I estimate the cold interior zone will reach the center of the cabin's floor by sometime in late autumn or early winter. This means the cabin will be effectively outside, fully penetrated by the cold in the way an unheated structure is penetrated, by the time the next serious winter arrives. He wrote, "I do not recommend Elias remain in the cabin. I do not know what the cabin will do to him if he remains. I know what it has already done. It has taken the warmth he has put into it and used it to intensify the cold at the wall. And the wall has been growing colder, and the cold has been spreading inward for 2 months. I do not think this process will stop if he stays. I think it will stop if he goes." He added this final sentence as speculation, not as something he could support from the measurements. But he had been watching the pattern for 2 months, and the pattern had told him. When Elias was absent, the cold diminished. He was not ready to say the cabin would return to normal if Elias left permanently. He was ready to say he suspected it. He gave the recommendation. Elias heard it. He stayed another week. He stayed because the trapping season had not technically ended, and because he was a man who did not like to be moved out of a place before he had decided to go. He spent that final week with the specific attention of a man preparing to close an account. He noticed something in that week that he had not named before. The frost on the inside of the east window had a quality of stillness that ordinary frost did not have. Ordinary frost, the kind on the outer face, responded to conditions. A warmer afternoon softened its edges. A wind shift altered its patterns. Frost was alive to variables. The frost on the inside of his east window did not respond. He had been watching it for 2 months, and it had never changed between morning and evening. It was the same density when he stoked the fire as when he let it bank low. It did not thin in the warmest part of the afternoon. It was fixed at a specific state, the way cold air was present, not as an effect of conditions, but as a condition itself. It was there. He wrote his last journal entry from the cabin. "I am leaving tomorrow. The frost is on the inside of the east window, as it has been since January 14th. The east wall measures 31 degrees at the glass. The room center is 49 degrees. The differential is 18 degrees. I have been warm enough throughout. The anomaly has not been dangerous to my health as far as I can determine, but I find that I am tired. Not physically tired. Tired in the way of a man who has been in a wrong situation for too long. I will come back in July and see what the cabin is like in the summer. He packed and left. Elias did not remain in the cabin. He left in the second week of March, when the trapping season wound down and the practical reasons for staying had diminished. He packed his equipment and his supplies and his journal, and he went to a boarding situation at the Pratt farm until he could find alternative winter quarters. He did not say he was leaving because of the cold. He said the trapping season was over and he needed to find better land. The Hollow knew because the Hollow always knew, and no one pressed him on it. 3 people went to the cabin after Elias left to see what it was like with no one in it. They went on separate occasions over the following weeks, and what they reported was consistent. The east window's interior frost was present, but thin, significantly less than what Elias had described in February, less even than what Nathan had measured in late January. The east wall was cold, but not dramatically cold. The differential between wall and room temperature closer to what a normal unheated cabin in March would produce. Nathan went himself in the 3rd week of March. He stood in the empty cabin with his thermometers and took the measurements he had been taking for 2 months, following the same protocol. Glass surface temperature, east wall temperature at mid-height, east wall temperature at floor level, room center temperature. He took each measurement twice to confirm. The east wall was cold, 34 degrees at the glass, 41 at the base of the east wall. The room temperature without a fire was 37 degrees. A cold day in March, the cabin having absorbed the outdoor temperature in the absence of any heat source. He sat down in the single chair that Elias had left behind, a heavy chair, too large to take, and looked at his readings and looked at the records he had with him from January and February. January 16th, glass 19, east wall mid-28, east wall base not yet measured, room center 53. February 8th, glass 21, east wall mid-29, east wall base 27, room center 51. March with Elias present. Glass 24, east wall mid-31, east wall base 24, room center 48. March, Elias absent. Glass 34, east wall mid-40, east wall base 41, room center 37. He sat with these numbers. The March numbers with Elias absent were the numbers of a normal unheated cabin. The temperature differential across the east wall was consistent with the outdoor temperature on that day. Nothing was anomalous. If he had walked into this cabin without the previous 2 months of records, he would have found an ordinary cold, empty cabin and left. He wrote, "Without Elias in the cabin, the measurements are normal." He wrote, "Not just less anomalous, normal." The cold that had been 30 degrees below room temperature is now 3 degrees below room temperature. The ground frost patterns are gone. The east wall is the temperature it should be for an unheated cabin on a March day. He wrote, "The measurements confirm what the pattern suggested when Elias was absent for 3 days in January. The anomaly is not in the cabin. The anomaly is in the cabin when Elias is in it." He put down the journal and sat for a while with that. He thought what the cabin was doing was not something the cabin was doing alone. It was something the cabin was doing in response to the person inside it. The warmth Elias added to the space generated the cold at the wall, not because warmth generates cold in ordinary circumstances, but because this particular space translated warmth into cold in a way Nathan could not account for and had spent 2 months failing to account for. I do not know what was happening in this cabin. I have the measurements, and I have the sequence. Present person, anomalous cold; absent person, normal cold. And I do not have an explanation that I trust. He wrote, "The closest account I have is this. Some places respond to presence in ways we do not understand. This cabin, in this winter, responded to the presence of a person by intensifying the cold at its east boundary. The greater the warmth inside, the colder the wall became. The relationship was not additive. The warmth did not add to a fixed cold. It was generative. The warmth generated the cold. The cold existed only in proportion to the warmth." He wrote, "A cabin is meant to hold warmth, to be the space where human heat accumulates and is protected from the outside cold. This cabin was not holding the warmth. It was using the warmth, converting it into the thing the warmth was supposed to protect against. I don't know what that means physically. I know it's what the measurements show." He put away his thermometers and went outside. The March morning was cold, but ordinary. The March morning was cold, but ordinary. The wind was moving through the hollow the way it always moved. The cabin stood on the south-facing slope of the east ridge, its east wall facing the morning, the east window catching the early light. The window was clear. Inside and outside, the glass was clear. Nathan stood in the cabin yard and looked at the clear window for a moment. He thought, the window had once kept the winter out. For 2 months it had marked where the inside ended, and where the cold had already begun. Now the person who needed keeping was gone, and the window was a window again, and the cold was where the cold was supposed to be. He turned and walked back down the slope toward the hollow. He did not look back at the cabin. Walking down, he thought about what the cabin had been for those 2 months, and what it had become. He thought about the threshold that a window represented, the boundary between 2 different temperature states, 2 different conditions of air. A window worked because one side was one thing and the other side was something else, and the glass held the distinction between them. He thought about what happened when the distinction failed, when the inside face of the glass became as cold as the outside face, when the wall that faced the morning sun ran colder than the wall that faced the night. He thought, the window had once kept the winter out. Now it only showed where the cold had already crossed. He came down to the hollow and went back to his farm and added his final measurements to the record and closed it. The window had once kept the winter out. Now it only showed where the cold had already crossed, and where the inside had stopped being inside. Elias Mott did not return to the cabin that winter. He found different quarters, and he let the cabin sit through the spring, and he went back to it in July, as he had told himself he would, to assess whether to return. He came up the south slope of the east ridge on a July morning, the trail overgrown slightly from 6 months without his regular passage, the summer vegetation closing in on the path that his feet had kept clear for 8 years. The cabin was there, the same building, the same south-facing slope, the same east window catching the morning light. He stood in the yard for a moment before going in. Then he went in. The interior was hot in the way of an unventilated cabin in July, the accumulated heat of summer inside a closed structure, the air thick and still. He opened the door wide and opened the east window, and the summer air moved through and the temperature dropped to something more bearable. He stood in the cabin and felt the ordinary summer heat of it. He pressed his hand against the east wall's interior surface. Warm. The wall was warm with the summer's stored heat, warmer even than the center of the room, the way a south-facing wall ran warm in summer. He held his hand against it for a moment and felt the ordinary warmth. He went to the east window and put his palm against the glass. Warm. The summer sun had been on the glass, and the glass was warm, the ordinary warmth of summer glass. He stood at the east window and looked at the glass. No frost, of course. It was July, and the temperature was 68 degrees, and frost required something other than July. But he stood there and tried to find in the summer glass any trace of what the January glass had been. He could not find it. The glass was glass. The wall was a wall. The cabin was a cabin. He stood in the room for a long time. He thought, from January to March, in this room, the east wall was colder than the north wall, and the window was frosted on the inside, and Nathan measured the differential at 30 degrees, and the ground frost patterns appeared on the vertical glass in February. And then I left, and it stopped. I am standing in the same room. It is a different room now. He thought about going back in the winter. He thought about it seriously. He had 8 years in this cabin, and the land was his, and the building was good, and the trapping on the north drainage was productive. He sat in the chair Nathan had sat in March, and he thought about it with the same attention he gave to practical decisions. In September, when the cold began to come back to the ridge, he decided. He found other winter quarters. He did not return to the cabin. Commutales, stories from the edges of the recorded world,